Okay, our previous discussions in this chapter have been about cells and cell types. Now we're going to talk about the tissues that fall within those cell types. So we have four primary groups of tissues. We have epithelial tissues, connective tissues, muscle tissue, and nervous tissue. So within those four types, though, there are about 200 subgroups. We'll take a few minutes and talk about each of these. Characteristics of epithelial tissues. Just in general, even though there are a dozen different epithelial tissues that we deal with, they all have some very basic characteristics in common. Epithelial tissues cover things. They line cavities. Basically, every exposed surface has epithelial tissue, including glands, and all of our glands are derived from epithelial tissues. Now, the functions of epithelial tissue are to protect, as in our skin, absorb. We have the lining in our digestive tract, filtration, such as in our kidneys, or secretion, like we have in some glands. Basic characteristics of epithelial tissues is that the cells fit closely together and oftentimes form sheets, again, like our skin. The apical surface, that is, there is a free surface that is exposed to the external environment. And then we have a lower surface that rests on some connective tissue. So everywhere that we have epithelial tissue, we have connective tissue below, and everywhere we have epithelial tissue, we have an exposed area. Now, epithelial tissues have no blood supply of their own. They heal very easily because they can absorb their nutrients from the tissues below, but they have no blood supply on their own. And depending on how good the blood supply is in the area that they're at, they can regenerate actually quite easily, but they have to be pretty well nourished to do that. Now, a graphic of just what that looks like is here. We have cells, and the cells are in contact with one another. They have a lower surface of connective tissue and an exposed upper surface. And that upper surface could be the environment, like our skin. It could be a tube, like a blood vessel. But there is an area that is exposed to a surrounding environment. Now, we classify epithelial tissues by just a few characteristics, actually. The number of cells, or cell layers. Now, things can be one layer thick, or more than one layer, basically. So, simple is one layer thick. If it has more than one layer, and that can be 2 to 1,000, it doesn't matter, anything more than one is considered stratified. We also classify them based on the shapes of the cells. So, squamous, that is flattened out. That one's a word that's a little hard to remember. The other two make a little more sense. Cuboidal, they're square, cube-shaped. They're basically as tall as they are wide. And then we have columnar, which is shaped like a column. That is, they are considerably taller than they are wide. Now, with that combination of two characteristics, we can have simple flat epithelium, which is simple squamous, which is a single layer of flat cells. These usually form body membranes, and they line body cavities. They line lungs, they line capillaries. And examples here. It's a very thin layer, and you see actually there's connective tissue here, and just lying on the side. And this is cut from a side view, so you really don't see very much, very well. These are hollow spaces within the lungs. Now, cuboidal, simple cuboidal, is a single layer of cube-shaped cells. These are common in glands and in ducts. They form a big part of kidney tubules, and when we look at these in lab, the examples that we have are going to be taken from kidney tubules. They also cover the ovaries. And here's an example of simple cuboidal epithelium. This is taken from a kidney. Now, if you look closely, you will see a little hollow area here, and then we have little square cells that form this tube, and this dark pink staining area is the connective tissue below. Now, simple columnar, that's a single layer of tall cells, and this often has stuff that will produce mucus, because this tends to line digestive tract, respiratory trees, things like that, and anything that is exposed to the outside environment generates mucus. So basically we have mucus producing cells that go from our oral cavity all the way to our anus. This is pretty much what it looks like, and this is typical of the digestive tract. We have connective tissue below, we have tall, thin columns of cells, and generally the nucleus of the cell is pretty close to the basement membrane. Also, these cells tend to have a structure called microvilli. These are just short little projections, which gives this edge kind of a darker staining look to it. There is another kind of epithelia called pseudostratified. I don't know if you've had medical terminology, but pseudo basically means false. So pseudostratified is something that looks like it has multiple layers. In truth, it does not. It has a single layer. Some cells are shorter than others, some cells overlap in a way, and the ultimate appearance is that of a column. What we evaluate the shape by is what the very top bit of the tissue looks like. So most of the time, actually, this has cilia, and we see that in the respiratory tract. It can function in absorption and secretion as well. But appearance-wise, what we have here, you can see here's a column, and this, by the way, is a mucus-producing area. This is a goblet cell, and it's called a goblet cell because it is shaped somewhat like a goblet, and this is all mucus. And here are the nuclei, and you can see they're kind of stacked. There's a nucleus, there's a nucleus, there's a nucleus, there's a nucleus. All of that making it appear like it's multiple layers thick. But the fact is that this cell has a projection that reaches down and touches the connective tissue below, just as this cell does. So all of these are in contact with the connective tissue. These are the cilia, and as you can see, they are longer hair-like projections, and they actually waft in one direction, taking the mucus that has been produced and moving it along, in the case of the respiratory tree, up to the throat where it can be swallowed. And the mucus acts to capture any kind of microorganisms or dust or other particles that we may breathe in. Now, that takes care of the non-stratified. We have, one layer of either columns or, that takes care of the simple epithelia, where we have one layer, and we have one layer of cuboidal, we have one layer of squamous, or we have one layer of columnar. And then we have something that looks like we have two layers of columnar, but it's really only one. So, you should be able to identify if I said I had a single layer thickness of square cells. You should be able to tell me that that's simple cuboidal. Okay? Now, the stratified epithelium, what we have are more cells, more layers of cells, and it can, again, be just more than one. We look at the top layer of cells to see what they look like. So cells at the top in stratified squamous are flattened. The cells at the bottom may not be. But this is found as a protective covering in areas where there's lots of friction. Locations include the mouth, the skin, the esophagus, the anus, the vagina. These are areas that are exposed to frictional forces, and so we have this upper layer of cells that is dead and can slough off. What this looks like is just this. This is the epithelium lining the esophagus. So food passes through here, and these upper cells, being dead cells, protect the tissues below from any damage. So this is the connective tissue. At this very bottom layer here, we have a set of cells that are forming new cells. So this is actually our stratum basale. And then as we go up, these cells start to die off, and looking here, they're sort of cube shaped, but by the time we get to the top, they are flattened out, and that's where we get the stratified characteristics of them. There are stratified cuboidal. We're not going to see those in lab. It's relatively rare. It exists in the epididymis of the male reproductive tract. There is stratified columnar. Those are also relatively rare. Again, they found mainly in ducts of large glands, so we're not going to look at those in lab. Now, transitional epithelium is called transitional because it doesn't have the usual clearly defined shapes. Well, we have cuboidal or squamous or whatever, but transitional epithelium can have any of a number of shapes just depending on how much it's stretched. This is tissue that lies in areas that are subject to stretch, specifically in the urinary system, as this has lots and lots of tight junctions that prevent the fluid from leaking, and it's still very stretchy in appearance. Now, what we see is, if you look here, here's the connective tissue, and that cell shape, that's not cuboidal, that's not squamous. This looks kind of like a column. We've got some that are flattened and sideways, so they can have a variety of appearances just depending on the degree of stretch. If you see something that has lots of different cell shapes, what you're looking at, most likely, is transitional epithelium. You might see a lot of different cell shapes as well if you were looking at some cancerous tumor, but first off, I'm not going to show you a cancerous tumor in class. Secondly, cells would be undergoing a lot of mitosis if they were in a tumor. Now, glandular epithelium, all of the glands in our body, all of the sweat glands, tear ducts, the glands in our thyroid, all of these are derived from epithelial tissue. In a gland, we have one or more cells responsible for secreting some product out into the bloodstream or out onto a surface. So we have really two kinds of glands. We have endocrine glands or exocrine glands. Now, endocrine glands do not have any duct. What they do is they seep their material out into the surrounding fluids, which gets picked up by the bloodstream and carried off to different parts of the body. This is what we have to secrete hormones. Now, exocrine glands, these secrete via a duct to a specific surface. So sweat glands, oil glands, salivary glands, tears, all of that, that's an exocrine gland. And at that point, we have covered the nature of our epithelial tissues. And this is a good place to stop. We will pick up on a subsequent discussion with connective tissues. So thank you very much.